Welcome to People, Power, and Politics. Hard talk, riveting interviews, community updates, in-depth analysis. That's People, Power, and Politics. We tell it to you as it is. No holds barred. You are the people, you have the power. We bring you the politics. To listen to our show, be a guest, or to advertise, visit www.pppradio.nyc. That's www.pppradio.nyc.
A very warm welcome to everyone. We are joined by Mr. Kevin Kenny, who teaches history at NYU. He's also the author of The Problem of Immigration in a Slaveholding Republic, Policy and Mobility in the 19th Century United States. And our topic of discussion is the border battle, Texas versus the U.S. government. Welcome, sir. Good to have you here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
You're very welcome. So, can you provide an overview of the recent conflict between USA and Texas officials regarding immigration and border control?
So what's happening today is Texas is attempting to make immigration law in the sense of controlling national borders. And that creates a constitutional crisis because for a long time, since the late 19th century, it's been established that the national government controls national borders. Right now, Texas is deliberately infringing on that power in an election year, and we have the makings of a constitutional crisis.
Okay. All right. So when you mention constitutional crisis, can you expand on that a bit?
So we live in a federal republic. Power is divided between the center and between the states. It always has been. So the question then is who controls immigration in the United States? There's really two answers to that question. One is immigration in the sense of national borders. Who has power to admit foreign people into the United States, to exclude them, or to deport them? So that's one way of looking at immigration law. There's a second way of looking at immigration law, which is after foreigners like me are allowed into the country, well then cities and states have an important role to play in integrating and helping immigrants, or sometimes in deterring them and monitoring and punishing them, right? So we've got these two different senses of immigration law. What's happening in Texas and other states in the Union is a deliberate attempt to blur that distinction. And if a state, an individual state or a city, makes its own immigration law in the first sense of controlling national borders, well, then that state is infringing on federal power. And the consequences of that are potentially catastrophic. One, in the realm of foreign policy. How can you have an individual state making the foreign policy of the United States? That's Mexico's objection. The other is on the lives of immigrants. Because immigrants as persons, they're not yet citizens. Immigrants as persons have federal protections. They have protections under the 14th Amendment and other aspects of law. State measures tend to be much harsher, much more punitive. And if you're a person with a brown skin in Texas today, that's not a comfortable thing to be.
Very well said. So what specific provisions does the Texas law blocked by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit entail, and how do they aim to regulate immigration?
So the specific provision that's at stake here is the law in Texas that criminalizes entry. Now, sure, the migrants are entering Texas, but they're also entering the United States. Jurisdiction over who enters the United States lies with the United States, not with any individual state. That's the constitutional question.
So what are the main arguments put forward by Texas officials in support of the law, and how do they justify the state's involvement in immigration control?
So the main arguments put forward on the Texas side is that the problem of immigration down there is spiraling out of control, that locally they cannot handle the scale of the immigration, much of which they categorize as illegal I might categorize it as asylum seekers, people who are seeking refuge in the United States. Their position is that, look, the federal government is meant to be in charge of this, but it's not doing an adequate job. And so we know from the news that they've been busing foreign people up here. And never forget, this is an election year. This is an attempt to push the federal government to act in a certain way. It's pushed Biden to the right on immigration, and it's beginning to remind us of the previous administration's policies. So that's the Texas argument. They're using the language of an invasion. They're saying it's not just the United States. Texas is being invaded by foreigners. They're calling all of them illegal. It's not illegal to seek refuge and asylum under international law.
It's not at all.
And this is they're threatening the federal government that they will do it if the feds don't step in. The federal argument, right? The national argument is that
was my next question.
is twofold. Firstly, this undermines the foreign policy of the United States. If an individual state makes immigration policy in the sense of controlling national borders, well, think of the repercussions to that. Mm-hmm. The Mexican government objected on exactly those grounds. They said an individual state can't make foreign policy with us, and we're not going to accept anybody who's deported from the state of Texas. Right, so there's the foreign policy question. The other question is the welfare of foreign-born people when they enter the United States. There are federal protections for people, not just as citizens, as persons under the law. State-level policies are likely to be much harsher.
And that's really opening a Pandora box. If, Texas is allowed to take control of immigration, then another state may want to take control of something else, which is, the federal responsibility.
Six other states have laws pending or passed that are intruding on federal power in this way, from Iowa to Kansas to Georgia, Louisiana, you name it. This affects immigration. It also affects reproductive rights. It also affected the kind of care that people could get during the COVID pandemic. At the height of the pandemic isn't over, but at the height of the pandemic, where you lived determined what rights you could get access to. These are federal rights, but states are impinging.
So let's go back to the U.S. Court of Appeals decision for the Fifth Circuit to block the Texas law. How significant is that, preventing it from taking effect?
Does the law violate the Constitution? And the part of the Constitution or constitutional law that it would violate is federal authority over national borders, right? That's the constitutional question. Mm-hmm. How significant is it that the appeals court is blocking the law? It's really significant because last month the Supreme Court, in effect, said, "Oh, just go ahead," and that can stay in force. That terrible law in Texas can stay in force until such time as the courts take a look at it. Right, so the Supreme Court didn't say that the law is valid. It just said that the lower court needs to take a look at it before it gets to us. And within 12 hours, the appeals court intervened and blocked it. Now, technically what they did was they refused to lift a stay on an injunction on a law. But in practical terms, what they did was they said, no, that can't go ahead. There were hearings last week on the constitutionality of the law before that court. It hasn't been decided. The court has not made its decision. Pending that decision, the law thankfully remains on hold. When that decision is made, the Supreme Court may then look at it. And if the Supreme Court upholds the Texas law, it will overturn the constitutional balance of power on immigration that was set by during the period of the Civil War and Reconstruction.
Okay. Now, you mentioned earlier about the 6 states who seem to be taking the direction of Texas. What role do you think that they might play in shaping future immigration policies with that trend?
So states and local jurisdictions will always play a role in immigration policy in the second sense, right, which is integrating immigrants after they arrive. Some states like New York or California provide sanctuary and help immigrants. Others monitor and punish and deter immigrants. It depends on where you're living in the country. If the states were given free rein on immigration in both senses, how to treat immigrants in violation of federal protections, and then how to control the borders of the nation, the impact would be catastrophic.
So in the context of historical precedents, how does this conflict between federal and state governments over immigration compare to similar past disputes?
This is part of a long-standing issue in American history. It goes under the heading of immigration federalism. So we live in a federal republic with sovereignty divided between the center and the localities. And the question on when it comes to immigration and many other matters is, to what extent can local jurisdictions act without violating powers that have been given to the federal government? This played out throughout the 19th century. Before the Civil War and Reconstruction, Congress played almost no role in regulating borders. And that's a bit of a mystery. If you go to the Constitution of the United States, and the United States is the country in the world that attracted more immigrants from more countries than any place else, right? The term nation of immigrants is used for that reason. It was also a nation of enslaved people and a nation of conquest of indigenous people. So if you would think in a country like this, with 50 million foreign-born people today and a history of immigration, that the Constitution might provide some clarity. The Constitution doesn't say anything about immigration. It's silent on that question. It says something about naturalization. Once you enter the country, then the federal government dictates a naturalization policy whereby you can become a citizen. But it doesn't say anything about national borders, about admission or exclusion. It does say something about one kind of migration, and that's the external slave trade. And one provision in the Constitution says that Congress cannot prohibit the external slave trade for 20 years. Now, if you think about that, Congress is recognizing the existence of slavery in the Constitution. Exactly. It's also saying that you can't touch this for 20 years. Sure enough, in 1808, Congress immediately curtails the external slave trade, the importation of enslaved people into the United States. That's the first provision on migration in American history. It affects enslaved black people. My sense as a historian is, for the first century of the Republic, Congress wouldn't go near immigration. And a national immigration policy emerged only during Civil War and Reconstruction. That's not a coincidence, because the fundamental obstacle to the exertion of federal power throughout the first 6 decades of 19th century was the existence of slavery. Because if you gave Congress the power to regulate human mobility under the heading of immigration, well, what are the consequences, say, for the internal slave trade or for the movement of free black people between the states? This is all controlled at local level. So there's a huge constitutional argument and division. It can't really be resolved until the Civil War. Once slavery is removed, once it's abolished and the southern states have temporarily left the Union, then the Supreme Court has no problem saying, oh, immigration, that's a federal matter. So on that basis, you get the emergence of a federal policy. So this has very deep roots. These questions of immigration federalism involving the regulation of black bodies that move from place to place. Immigration can't be understood apart from slavery and the regulations on the movement of free black people in the 19th century, all of which was controlled at the state and local level. The federal government wouldn't touch it.
So, as a historian, what do you think are some of the potential consequences, both short-term and long-term, of the outcome of this legal battle on immigrant communities, law enforcement, and the broader society?
Well, I think that the potential consequences are catastrophic. I've mentioned the ability of the United States to conduct its own foreign policy. That's one thing. I'm more concerned about the lives of ordinary people seeking refuge in this country. We have a tradition of providing refuge, and also the consequences for those who are already here, because you quickly get smeared with the brush of illegality if it applies to people of your kind. The current constitutional balance of power when it comes to mobility and immigration was set during the Civil War and Reconstruction. And unbridled state power in the present would overturn that balance. The most important amendment to the Constitution of all, I think, came as a direct result of the Civil War and Reconstruction. That's the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment came out of a war to end slavery. It was a repudiation of the Dred Scott decision. And what it said was, you can be a citizen of the United States if you're born here or if you naturalize. Okay. And it's the federal government that's saying that, not the states.
Okay, so looking ahead, what steps do you believe need to be taken to address the underlying tensions between federal and state governments regarding immigration control, and how might these conflicts be resolved in a manner that respects both federal authority and state autonomy?
Well, I think that question gets back to my original point about we need to view immigration in two senses, right? One is national borders, the other is the welfare of foreign-born people after they've entered the country. The first of those is a federal matter. The second involves local jurisdiction. So I would say, in my opinion, it's important that the Supreme Court uphold the power of the national government to control its own borders. And then when it comes to dealing with the lives of immigrants after they enter, what we see is a bifurcation. Right, there are certain parts of the country that are providing sanctuary and even forms of citizenship and voting even. In New York City, New York State, those proposals are underway. Other parts of the country are seeking not just to monitor and punish immigrants who are in place, but to really deter immigration per se. So at the local level, all I could say is I would hope that local communities would see an affirmative commitment to all people as people, regardless of their background or origin.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Kevin Kenny, for providing us with this insightful information on this hot topic.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
People, Power, and Politics. Hard talk, riveting interviews, community updates, in-depth analysis. That's People, Power, and Politics. We tell it to you as it is. No holds barred. You are the people, you have the power. We bring you the politics. To listen to our show, be a guest, or to advertise, visit www.pppradio.nyc. That's www.pppradio.nyc.